The day our new CEO fired a 73-year-old man in a wheelchair, she thought she was getting rid of dead weight. What she actually did was light a match under a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. By the time she realized her mistake, entire projects had been frozen, investors were panicking, and the man she humiliated was already walking straight into the arms of our biggest competitor. The craziest part? Everybody in the building except her knew exactly what was about to happen. The story took place at a biotech engineering company outside Raleigh, North Carolina, where I worked as a senior process engineer. From the outside, the company looked unstoppable. New contracts every quarter, cutting-edge research, expansion plans, magazine interviews. The kind of place college graduates dreamed about joining. But if you asked anybody who actually worked there what made the company successful, most of us would have given the same answer. Not the executives, not the board, not the investors. A man named Walter Grayson. Now, Walter wasn't Apos, the founder. He wasn't Apos, even an executive. Technically, his title was Principal Innovation Consultant, which sounds impressive until you realize nobody could actually explain what he did all day. Most mornings, he and Apos roll into the building around 7:30 in his wheelchair, carrying a weathered leather briefcase older than half the employees. Then he and Apos disappear into his office surrounded by stacks of notebooks, engineering diagrams, patent drafts, and enough coffee to medically concern a cardiologist. If you didn't and Apos know better, you and Apos assume he was some retired guy the company kept around out of loyalty. That and Apos, that's exactly what our new CEO thought. Huge mistake. See, Walter was one of those rare people whose fingerprints were everywhere. He and Apos spent 40 years designing proprietary systems, production methods, and specialized equipment that powered nearly every major breakthrough the company had achieved. Most employees never fully understood how much of the operation depended on him because Walter never bragged about anything. He wasn't Apos, flashy. He wasn't Apos, political. He didn't Apos, spend time networking. Frankly, he was awkward as hell socially. But if a production line failed, Walter fixed it. If a project stalled, Walter solved it. If regulators raised concerns, Walter somehow already had 3 alternative solutions sitting in a notebook somewhere. The old CEO adored him. Everybody respected him. Then retirement happened. The old leadership stepped down, and the board brought in a new CEO named Vanessa Cole. Well, that and Apos, that's what I and Apos am calling her. Different name, same disaster. Vanessa arrived with the energy of somebody trying to prove she belonged in the corner office before anyone had questioned it. During her first week, she changed reporting structures. During her second week, she reorganized departments. By week 3, she was holding mandatory meetings about productivity metrics nobody asked for. It felt less like leadership and more like someone rearranging furniture in a house they hadn't and Apos lived in long enough to understand. At first, we gave her the benefit of the doubt. New leaders always shake things up. But then she started targeting specific people. And for reasons nobody could understand, Walter ended up at the top of that list. Looking back now, I think Walter represented everything Vanessa hated. Experience she couldn't and Apos, control. Respect she hadn't and Apos, earned. Influence she couldn't and Apos, measure on a spreadsheet. One afternoon I was reviewing equipment specifications when shouting echoed down the hallway. Not normal workplace arguing either, real screaming. The kind that makes people stop typing. Doors opened all across the floor. Heads turned. And every sound seemed to lead back toward Walter and Apos' office. I walked out just in time to hear Vanessa and Apos' voice cutting through the corridor. And quote, I Don and Apos, care what happened under previous leadership, and quote, she snapped. End quote. This company ISN and Apos, paying people to sit around staring at paperwork all day. End quote. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Walter and Apos' office door was partially open. We couldn't and Apos see much, but we could hear enough. Then Vanessa said something that changed everything. End quote. Maybe everybody in Apos has been treating you differently because of your age and your wheelchair, but that ends now. End quote. My stomach dropped. Several employees looked at each other immediately. You could feel the tension spreading through the building like electricity. Walter answered quietly. We couldn't and Apos hear the words. Vanessa could, and whatever he said made her even angrier. End quote. Don and Apos T lecture me about contracts, end quote. She barked. End quote. I and Oppos, am the CEO. I decide who stays and who goes, end quote. Another pause. Then came the sentence nobody ever forgot, end quote. Clean out your office and be gone by the end of the day, end quote. The hallway went completely silent. I remember standing there thinking surely someone from HR would intervene. Surely somebody from legal would stop this. Surely a CEO couldn't and Oppos be reckless enough to fire one of the most important people in the company without understanding the consequences. But nobody stopped her. A few minutes later, Walter rolled out of his office carrying that old leather briefcase. No speech, no anger, no scene. He simply nodded to a few employees, thanked his assistant for her years of work, and headed toward the elevator. As he passed me, I noticed something strange. He didn't end Oppos. He looked defeated. If anything, he looked disappointed. Like a teacher watching a student confidently fail a test they never bothered studying for. And that was the moment I realized something terrifying. Walter wasn't Oppos. He worried about losing his job. He was worried about what was about to happen to the company after he left. The morning after Walter Grayson was fired felt weird in a way that and Oppos. It's hard to explain unless you and Oppos lived through it. The building looked exactly the same. Same glass walls, same parking lot, same expensive corporate artwork hanging in the lobby. But underneath all that, something had shifted. People spoke quieter. Meetings felt tense. Even the coffee station seemed unusually crowded because employees kept gathering there to exchange theories about what had happened. Nobody could understand why Vanessa would make a move that aggressive during her first month as CEO. Then again, most of us still assumed she knew something we didn't and Oppos. Surely the board had reviewed everything. Surely legal had approved it. Surely nobody could accidentally fire the person responsible for half the company and Oppos' intellectual foundation. By lunchtime, we learned how wrong we were. It started with a production issue in Facility 3. A manufacturing system suddenly stopped processing calibration data correctly. Normally that wouldn't Oppos been a minor inconvenience because Walter had solved similar problems dozens of times before. Except Walter wasn't Oppos there anymore. Engineers spent 6 hours trying to diagnose it. Nothing worked. Eventually somebody found a note in an old project archive referencing a custom workaround Walter had created 8 years earlier. The problem? Nobody understood how the workaround actually functioned. We patched things temporarily and moved on. Then another issue appeared. Then another. By Friday afternoon, 3 separate departments were digging through decades of documentation, trying to figure out systems Walter had quietly maintained behind the scenes for years. It was like discovering the plumbing blueprint for a skyscraper had been written in a language only one person could read. Meanwhile, Vanessa acted completely unfazed. During an executive meeting, she reportedly told department heads, end quote, no individual is irreplaceable, end quote. That and Oppos. That's one of those statements executives love because it sounds strong and decisive. Reality, unfortunately, doesn't and Oppos care about motivational slogans. The following week brought our first major crisis. A pharmaceutical client worth nearly $70 million requested modifications to a proprietary production process. Simple request on paper. Normally Walter Wood and Oppos handled it in an afternoon. Instead, team spent 9 days arguing over technical specifications because nobody could determine why certain system limitations existed in the first place. Every answer led back to Walter and Oppos' old notes. Every solution eventually traced back to Walter and Oppos' designs. Every road somehow ended at the same locked door. Then came the patents. God, the patents. One of our legal teams discovered Walter wasn't Oppos. Just an employee contributor. Over decades, he had structured numerous intellectual property agreements under consulting frameworks negotiated directly with previous leadership. Perfectly legal, perfectly documented, and suddenly very important. Vanessa apparently learned during a closed-door meeting that Walter retained significant rights related to several proprietary systems. Not ownership exactly, but enough influence to complicate modifications, licensing agreements, and future development. That and Oppos. When panic started creeping into upper management. At the same time, rumors began spreading through the company. Nobody knew where they originated, but they moved fast. Walter had received 3 job offers within 48 hours. Walter was meeting with competitors. Walter was consulting for venture-backed startups. Walter was building something new. Every version sounded slightly different, but they all carried the same message. Walter wasn't retiring. He was relocating his expertise. Then one Thursday afternoon, I got proof. I was grabbing lunch across town when I spotted Walter sitting outside a small restaurant with 2 executives from Helix Dynamics, our biggest competitor. Everybody in the industry knew those faces. The meeting looked casual, friendly even. Walter was smiling. Actually smiling. I hadn't seen that man smile at work in years. The second I got back to the office, whispers were already spreading. Somehow news traveled faster than I did. By the next morning, the stock price had dipped nearly 6% after analysts started questioning leadership stability and future innovation capacity. Investors weren't reacting to one fired employee. They were reacting to uncertainty. And Walter and Apo's departure had created a lot of uncertainty. That and Apo's when Vanessa finally shifted from confident to defensive. She started holding emergency meetings. She demanded status reports from every department. She pushed managers for productivity metrics, proving the company remained strong. But numbers couldn't hide what employees were experiencing every day. The cracks kept growing. One senior engineer resigned unexpectedly. Then another. A research director accepted a position elsewhere. Not because they hated the company, because they no longer trusted leadership. People can survive difficult workloads. They can survive market downturns. What they struggle to survive is watching decision-makers ignore obvious reality. Then came the board meeting. Nobody outside senior leadership attended, but details leaked almost immediately. Apparently, one board member asked a simple question. End quote. Before terminating Mr. Grayson, did anyone conduct a dependency analysis regarding operational continuity? End quote. Silence. Another board member reportedly asked, end quote, who approved the risk assessment? End quote. More silence. That and Apo's when people realized something incredible. There had been no meaningful assessment. No transition plan. No succession strategy. Vanessa had made the decision largely on her own because she believed Walter represented inefficiency rather than institutional knowledge. In other words, she mistook visibility for value. Walter looked invisible because he spent decades preventing problems before they happened. 3 weeks after his firing, reality delivered the knockout punch. Helix Dynamics announced a major technological breakthrough during an industry conference. The presentation stunned everyone. Not because the innovation was impossible, because it looked eerily familiar. Different enough to be legitimate. Similar enough to make people uncomfortable. Several concepts resembled projects Walter had discussed internally for years. Investors immediately connected the dots. Analysts connected the dots. Employees definitely connected the dots. Suddenly, the narrative changed completely. Walter wasn't some outdated consultant who got pushed aside. He was a strategic asset competitors were now benefiting from. I still remember the atmosphere the day that announcement hit. Phones ringing nonstop. Executives rushing between conference rooms. Department heads speaking in clipped sentences. And through all of it, one uncomfortable truth hanging over the company like a storm cloud. Vanessa hadn't removed dead weight. She had handed a competitive advantage directly to our biggest rival. Then something happened that made the situation even worse. A reporter published an investigative piece examining Walter and Apo's departure. Former employees gave interviews. Industry experts weighed in. Anonymous sources described internal concerns ignored by leadership. The article never outright accused Vanessa of discrimination or incompetence, but it didn't and Apo's need to. The story practically wrote itself. Experienced innovator fired by new executive. Critical knowledge lost. Competitor benefits. Company struggles. Investors hate stories that simple because they and Apo's easy to understand. And when investors understand a problem, they start demanding accountability. By the end of that month, whispers about leadership changes had reached every corner of the building. But the most shocking moment was still ahead. Because while everyone focused on stock prices, patents, and executive drama, almost nobody noticed what Walter had been doing since the day he left. And when that finally became public, it turned a corporate mistake into a full-blown catastrophe. The thing nobody understood at the time was that Walter Grayson hadn't Apos. He spent 40 years building a career. He and Apos. He spent 40 years building relationships. And relationships Don and Apos. He disappear when somebody gets fired. They follow them out the door. That and Apos. S what turned a bad executive decision into a disaster nobody could contain. About 5 weeks after Walter left, Helix Dynamics announced something that sent shockwaves through the entire biotech industry. They weren't Apos. Just launching a new innovation initiative. They were creating an advanced engineering division centered around process optimization, intellectual property development, and manufacturing efficiency. Guess who was leading it? Walter Grayson. The announcement hit our company like a freight train. Employees passed the press release around in private messages all morning. Managers pretended not to discuss it while clearly discussing nothing else. Even people who barely knew Walter understood the symbolism. Helix hadn't Apos. Simply hired him. They and Apos. Built an entire division around him. That kind of move doesn't and Apos. Happen for ordinary employees. That happens when somebody possesses knowledge considered strategically invaluable. And suddenly investors started asking a very uncomfortable question. If Helix thought Walter was worth building a division around, why had we fired him? Nobody had a good answer. The next quarterly earnings call turned into a bloodbath. Analysts grilled executives about leadership decisions. Institutional investors questioned long-term innovation strategies. One analyst directly asked whether the company had underestimated Walter and Apos' role in maintaining critical operational systems. The pause before Vanessa answered lasted just a little too long. Everybody noticed. A week later, internal rumors exploded again. Several major clients were requesting meetings. Not routine meetings. Concerned meetings. Clients wanted reassurance that ongoing projects would remain stable. They wanted guarantees that technical expertise hadn't and Apos left with Walter. And most importantly, they wanted proof. That and Apos when reality finally cornered leadership. Because confidence can replace facts for a while. But eventually customers start asking questions facts have to answer. One client worth nearly $90 million reportedly delayed contract expansion until further review. Another requested independent audits of certain production systems. A third began quietly exploring partnerships with Helix. Watching all this unfold felt surreal. For years, Walter had been treated like background scenery. Then suddenly his absence was dominating boardrooms across the industry. Meanwhile, something even more surprising happened inside the company. People started talking about Walter differently. Not as a consultant, not as an engineer, not even as an innovator. They started talking about him as a mentor. Stories surfaced everywhere. A young engineer revealed Walter had secretly helped pay tuition when her scholarship disappeared. A project manager admitted Walter spent months coaching him after a devastating mistake nearly ended his career. One technician shared that Walter attended his daughter and Apos' hospital fundraiser every year for a decade without telling anyone. The man had quietly invested in people the same way he invested in projects. No publicity, no recognition, no social media posts, just kindness. And that created a problem leadership never saw coming. Employees weren't and Apos' angry because a valuable worker got fired. They were angry because a good man got humiliated. There and Apos' a difference. One creates concern. The other creates loyalty. And loyalty is powerful. The breaking point arrived 2 months after Walter and Apos' departure. A confidential internal report somehow leaked. Nobody ever officially discovered who released it. But once it reached the press, everything changed. The report detailed operational risks associated with Walter and Apos' termination. Risks that several senior managers had apparently identified before the firing. Risks that had been communicated upward. Risks that were ultimately ignored. The headlines wrote themselves. Warning signs ignored. Expert concerns dismissed. Leadership failures exposed. Investors lost patience almost immediately. The board scheduled emergency meetings. Outside consultants arrived. Law firms got involved. And for the first time since becoming CEO, Vanessa stopped appearing publicly. The confidence disappeared. The speeches disappeared. The certainty disappeared. Because arrogance works best before consequences arrive. After that, it starts looking a lot like panic. 3 weeks later, the announcement came. Vanessa Cole had resigned. Officially, the departure was described as a mutual leadership transition. Nobody believed that for a second. Employees read the memo and laughed. Some applauded. Others just shook their heads. Honestly, I didn't and Oppos feel much of anything. By then the damage had already been done. A company that once felt stable had spent months tearing itself apart because one executive confused authority with understanding. And that and Oppos a mistake far too many leaders make. They think being in charge means knowing everything. It doesn't and Oppos Sometimes leadership means recognizing the smartest person in the room ISN and Oppos The strangest part happened about 6 months later. I ran into Walter at an industry conference. He was standing near a presentation booth, talking with a group of young engineers. Same wheelchair. Same old leather briefcase. Same calm expression. The only difference was he looked happier. Lighter somehow. When he saw me, he smiled. End quote. How are things? End quote. He asked. I laughed. End quote. Less dramatic now. End quote. End quote. Good. End quote. He said. Then after a pause, he added something I and Oppos LL never forget. End quote. Companies survive mistakes. Pride is what kills them. End quote. Simple sentence. 40 years of wisdom packed into 6 words. A year later, Helix Dynamics had become one of the fastest growing firms in the sector. Walter and Oppos' division was thriving. Several former colleagues eventually joined him. Not because they were chasing money, because they wanted to work somewhere expertise was respected. As for my old company, it survived too. New leadership came in. Processes improved. Trust slowly returned. But there was one thing nobody could ever undo. Every employee who lived through that period learned the same lesson. The most valuable people in an organization are often the ones making everything look easy. And when everything looks easy for long enough, executives start believing those people aren't and Oppos doing much at all. Until they and Oppos gone. Then suddenly everyone discovers the difference between visible work and essential work. Even today, whenever somebody says, end quote, no employee is irreplaceable, end quote, I think about Walter. Technically, maybe that and Oppos is true. Given enough time, anyone can be replaced. But that and Oppos is not the real question. The real question is how much damage gets done before that replacement happens. And sometimes the answer costs millions. Sometimes it costs reputations. Sometimes it costs entire careers. So what do you think? Was Vanessa simply an inexperienced leader who made one catastrophic mistake? Or was her downfall the inevitable result of arrogance and ego from the very beginning? And if you were sitting on that board of directors, would you have removed her immediately after firing Walter? Or given her a chance to fix the damage she created? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions about leadership, loyalty, and whether true expertise is ever really replaceable.